Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 4 of the War of the Jewels. I've been having some winter adventures recently. We just got a major snowstorm up here in New Hampshire where I am. And I was out of power for about 30 hours over the last 2 days, but power came back in plenty of time to be able to be with you here this evening. So I was very glad. Yeah, I don't really suspect Saruman, actually, JJ. I think that's quite wrong. I think the more people just suspected of being Saruman, the more you're just going to tick off the mountains, who are trying, to draw attention to themselves. But anyway, hey, I wanted to draw attention to a couple quick things. First of all, I wanted to mention, of course, it is Sunshine Moot this week. We have the next of our spring moots coming up here. This week is feeling like a grand week to go down to Florida, I have to admit. Anyway, yeah, so we're going to be down in Orlando, Florida this coming Saturday on March 18th. And you can there's still time for folks to join us if you're in the area and want to join us in Orlando. Well, it's not actually quite in Orlando. It's a little bit nearby. But you can also, of course, join us remotely as this moot, as all of our moots will be a hybrid moot. So, anyhow, so that's one thing to remind folks of. Another thing, at the Signum Press this week, we just released a significant thing, a new publication from Verlyn Flieger, who is, if any of you don't know the work of Verlyn Flieger, you should. Verlyn Flieger is like the matriarch of Tolkien studies. She is, has been the editor and publisher of a number of Tolkien's own works that have been published over the course of the last 15, 20 years. She has published herself extensively on Tolkien for a long time. She's actually as I believe, the first one. I think she was the first person to get her PhD by writing her dissertation on Tolkien. She is, Splintered Light is a classic of hers, Emily, one of the classics of Tolkien scholarship. Anyway, Verlyn Flieger is just a stupendous Tolkien scholar and an even more wonderful person. And she has published her latest book with the Signum University Press. It is a collection of essays and short stories and poems as well, including among her poetry in particular, a lot of very personal reflections on the death of her husband. Very moving, very vulnerable stuff there. So Verlyn Flieger is she's such a wonderful person. And I'm very honored that we are able to publish this book of hers, A Waiter Made of Glass. So if you go to Signum University Press, you can find the information on the release of that book today, or yesterday. Anyway, in the last couple of days, we've just released it. So wanted to definitely encourage you to look into that. In addition, I have been... what is today? Today's the 15th. So today is the day, sorry, all the time I've been out of power and therefore half cut off from the world for the last day and a half. I keep losing track even of the day. But today being the 15th of the month, that is, I almost said February. I can't even know. I should know at least what month it is. Being the 15th of March today, today is the day that the second chapter of my book dropped. So, of course, as many of you know, I am writing my new book, Exploring the Lord of the Rings. This is the long-awaited follow-up of my Hobbit book, Exploring the Hobbit. And, this book is really... I'm, when I am done with the whole thing, exploring the Lord of the Rings, which is going to be in 6 volumes, because I'm writing, I'm publishing 1 book on each of the 6 books of the Lord of the Rings. And when this 6-volume collection is done, this is going to be pretty much my magnum opus. This is going to be, sort of all of my thoughts on, or at least the significant majority of my thoughts on the Lord of the Rings, over the course of my career. So, really, I've been having such a ball writing this. I'm working on the prologue. My first 3 chapters are discussing Tolkien's prologue. And so the second chapter, the second of my prologue chapters, was released today. And that was, I've been having so much fun. The folks in my author circle, that is my sort of my insider support group, who have been my patrons and really helping me through this whole process, have been helping me with my revision. And I just, I did a revision I was so happy with. Was really excited about how chapter 2 came together. So that chapter just dropped today in the serial release model that we have at the Signum University Press, so that you can follow along and read the chapters as they drop for a subscription of only $2 a month. So anyway, so my second chapter dropped today. I'm going to be, my third and final chapter on the prologue is going to be next time. My third chapter is going to be on, so in my second chapter, I talked about concerning hobbits, and I was looking at the patterns that we can see in what Tolkien tells us about hobbits, like what he emphasizes when he explains and sort of sets up hobbit culture for us, and in particular, the way he goes back and looks at hobbit history. And then I did a lot of thinking about how his presentation of hobbits and their history dovetails with the framework that he establishes in the prologue, in which he is claiming that the history of the Shire is actual history and part of our real world, and that hobbits still exist today and are connected to and related to us as modern humans. Anyway, so I was sort of bringing that stuff together in chapter 2, and then we and now in chapter 3, what I'm finalizing this month is a discussion of Tolkien's summary of The Hobbit that we get, which is, spoiler, not actually a summary of The Hobbit. Anyway, I would that's been great fun. So if you want to be kind of part of this experience as I'm working through the book and as I'm rolling out the chapters, I encourage you to go to the Signum University Press page, press.signumuniversity.org, and look into the you can find my author page and then look at our subscription model, which, as I say, is $2 a month to subscribe to the ongoing chapters as they're released. So those are some of the many things that are going on here at Signum, and happy to share those things with you. Now, let's get back to the text, the War of the Jewels. So in real time, for those of you who are with me live, it's been several weeks since we have been able to meet. So let's try to remember where we were. We had just gotten to the place. We got to the end of the Grey Annals. That is, well, we're still in the section of the book of the War of the Jewels called the Grey Annals, but we're done with the part that's like the actually gray part. That is the part that's imaginatively ascribed to the Sindar themselves. I think there are still some memories of that as we move forward, but it seems clear, and he makes some it's not only just to do with where he is in the drafting, that is like we got to the end of the version where he was really doing that, but in addition, you can see that the ground sort of shifts, that instead of following the perspective of the Sindar throughout and giving us their side of the story, it now has shifted to a more Noldorin standpoint. So we're in the middle of a bunch of passages that jumped out at me because it's always fascinating for me to see what directions Tolkien's mind is going as he is rewriting, as he is reworking some of these things. And yeah, it is tricky. I say, it says I feel like I need to completely reread the Silmarillion. Yeah, that's really easy. It's really easy to feel that way when reading through stuff like The War of the Jewels. I find myself saying, gosh, that feels really familiar. Is that in the Silmarillion? Then I'm like, oh wait, no, that's in another version that we talked about before. And then sometimes I'll get myself confused and forget, like, okay, wait, is this thing in the published Silmarillion, or is this just in one of these other versions? It's easy to get kind of turned around. But anyway, as I say, there are a couple things that I'm really interested in tracing, that I'm always really interested in tracing as we're going through, these texts, which are the unfolding drafts of the story as Tolkien is working on them. One, as we've been focusing on since the very first session of the War of the Jewels discussion, has been the place that this holds in, like, what we can see based on the texts that we're looking at. What we can see about how Tolkien is understanding, in other words, what does he think he's doing? What exactly does Tolkien think he's doing? We're still in the early stages of the post Lord of the Rings period. So we're still in that point in the 50s when he was reworking stuff and when he was rewriting materials with the explicit idea that it was a drive to get this published, right? So this material that we're reading is still stuff that he hoped, thought, believed was likely to get to press sometime soon, which is different from what we'll see when we get to the stuff that he wrote later on, like in 1959, 1960, and later up through like 1965. The same time as a lot of the stuff from the Nature of Middle-earth. So by then, he had already given up on that. So after The Lord of the Rings is published, without the Silmarillion, then he has shifted gears. So that's the one question: what does Tolkien think he's doing, and what can we learn about that from looking at some of these things? But then, just secondly, how do we see the story developing? What can we learn about what Tolkien is seeing, what Tolkien is learning, the direction in which things are going as he's making changes based on what he's written before? And one of the important things to keep in mind, it's been a long time since, especially for those of you who have been following me along in real time, I know some of you might have been doing some catch up more recently, asynchronously, and so it might be fresher to you than it is to me. But the discussions that we had of, say, I'm looking up at my bookshelf here, of, say, The Shaping of Middle-earth or The Lost Road, was quite some time ago now. More than, 6-7 years or so, real time, since we had those discussions. I have to admit, I was getting off the shelf the Quenta Noldorinwa from The Shaping of Middle-earth, and the later Quenta Silmarillion from the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion, which you can find in The Lost Road, and kind of thumbing through that as I was reading the passages this week from The War of the Jewels, and I was like, boy, that feels like a long time ago. It feels very, very strange. But the thing that I was noticing, what I was going back to look for, the reason I was pulling these books down off the shelves and comparing, was it occurred to me as I was reading the Nirnaeth Arnoediad stuff. I was like, wait a second. When was the last time Tolkien wrote this stuff? How long's it been since Tolkien got this far in the story, because we're getting pretty significant. I mean, once you get up to the Beren and Luthien story and beyond the Beren and Luthien story, you're getting into some rarefied air in terms of Tolkien finishing stuff, right? He rewrites the early stuff quite frequently, but to actually get so far as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, now that is something, right? And it turns out I was right. What I was trying to remember, I was like, did he get to it in the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion revision? And no, he didn't get to it then. The material that we were reading through this week is stuff that he's not really written new material of. You know, he's not really gone over in detail and rewritten it since 1930 or even 1928. The original 1928 sketch of the mythology. So just briefly recalling from a few sessions back. So you'll remember it was the sketch of the mythology that he did in 1928. That was the original, I'm going to write a plot summary of the first age story, so that my colleague to whom I am going to lend the alliterative Children of Húrin can have some context for what he's reading, right? And so he called it the sketch of the mythology, and it was designed to be a sort of synopsis, and it is fairly short, but it depends on your point of view. Compared to the published Silmarillion, it's pretty short. Here's a little background reading on this long epic poem I'm letting you read. It's pretty long, right? As a preamble, it's pretty long. But he sketched out pretty much the whole story there in the sketch of the mythology in 1928. And then in 1930, in the Quenta Nolde Rinwa, he expanded it. So that's the moment in 1930 when he was like, hey, that was fun. I actually kind of like that model, that plot summary model, right? And so that's when he leans into that in the Quenta Nolde Rinwa, and then further in the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion. But getting up here, past Beren Luthien, is something is stuff he hasn't really done since he got to since like 1930 or even 1928. So there's a reason why so much of what we're reading in this is very familiar, right? A lot of the published Silmarillion is taken straight from the Grey Annals that we're reading right now. Because remember, Christopher Tolkien's approach, like his editorial process in choosing what versions of what texts make it into the published version, was simply, well, there's a bunch of provisos, but it's basically the latest full version that his father wrote of the story. I say full version because if he sketched ideas for what he wanted to do with it, but he didn't write it, Christopher didn't include it, even though he knew that, that Tolkien wanted to change the story and had decided firmly, I'm going to take the story in these new ways. But if he didn't write it, Christopher's like, I'm not writing it myself, right? I'm only going to include here completed texts written by my father, with only a couple places where Christopher had in desperation to connect dots. Yeah, exactly. David Michael Roberts says the sketch of the mythology which is in volume 4, The Shaping of Middle-earth, is 30 pages long. Yeah, exactly. It's again short compared to the published Silmarillion, but kind of long if you got that handwritten from a friend, right? Yeah. Anyhow, so there are two things that we learn from the fact that so much of what we're reading here in the Grey Annals is the material that Christopher ended up choosing for the published Silmarillion. One, of course, is that, these are full, late-ish, later than the early stuff, right, renditions of this stuff. But it's also a kind of warning, right? There's, for me, there's a little sadness in finding, it's always kind of fun to come across passages in the history of Middle-earth which are identical to the published Silmarillion, right? It's fun because it's almost like a scavenger hunt, right? Like, oh, hey, look, I found the source of that paragraph, that I remember in the published Silmarillion. But there's always a tinge of sadness to it for me, because when you're reading a passage of text that is identical to the published Silmarillion, what that probably means is Tolkien is not ever in his lifetime going to get back to writing this story again, right? That's why those of you who did the discussion with me from way back, from Volume 4, from The Shaping of Middle-earth, will remember that the Quentin Olderinwa version of The Fall of Gondolin is the text that's used in the published Silmarillion, because he never got back to it again, ever. Not to finish it. Again, see, that's a classic example. We have the Tuor stuff, the beginning, the Tuor fragment that's published in Unfinished Tales, but it's not finished, so Christopher didn't include it in the published Silmarillion. Anyway, so we're seeing Tolkien returning to stories that he's not rewritten for a long time, and by dint of their familiarity, we can tell that he's, for many of them, never going to get back to them again. And that's, it's interesting. As I say, it's both fun and also a little bit sad. Anyway, so today we're going to go through, I keep forgetting what I'm, the point I keep coming back around to from the introduction, my introduction here. And that is, what we're seeing, I think, one of the things that we see in this stretch, we were focusing on the early parts of the Grey Annals, which were that really fascinating imaginative experiment, which is framed as, here's the Sindar perspective on things. We're past that bit. And it seems to me that what we're getting is the story merely sort of drawing him along, right? Drawing Tolkien along. You'll remember that one of the questions I've been asking as we've going through the annals is, what does he think he's doing? What does Tolkien imagine this text to be? Originally, the annals were designed to accompany the Quenta. The Quenta Silmarillion, with the Quenta Noldorinwa, then changed to the Quenta Silmarillion. That was supposed to be the overall narrative, right? Like the overview narrative of the history. Then he started doing the annals, which seemed at first to just be an accompaniment, right? Let's just kind of try to keep the chronology straight so that you can have like a chronological reference to look at while you're reading the Quenta, right? But they're both going to get included because they're not like redundant or anything, right? But as he keeps going further and further into the annals, they seem to be getting more and more redundant, right? They are continuously expanding and really becoming, and we see that their destiny, right? Their destiny is to be taken by Christopher out of the annals and placed in the Quenta Silmarillion in the published version, right? So it's pretty clear that in Christopher's assessment, these two things, the annals on the one hand and the Quenta on the other hand, are really kind of merging together and in the end kind of doing the same thing. The passages that I've selected here are ones that do one of those two things, that either give us an interesting little glimpse into what Tolkien thinks he's doing and how he's framing this text, or it gives us an interesting glimpse into how the story is evolving, what is changing from and what it's changing to as he's revising. So I'm particularly interested. I always love most. You may remember when we were doing the history of the Lord of the Rings, the Return of the Shadow, the Treason of Isengard, the War of the Ring. My favorite parts of those books are his projected notes, right? His outlines of where the story was going to go next. It was so fascinating to see what he thought he was doing, right? How he was planning things, and then to watch what actually happened. And of course, it was fun because we already knew what he was going to end up doing, right? And so we could see it from the first moment that he says, all right, I'm going to make my projections, I'm going to sketch ahead. Here's what I think is going to happen. And we already knew what was actually going to happen, right? And so we could see the trend, the direction, how it was, he talks about the story growing in the telling. How did it grow, right? What was the before and what was the after? I always love that. So those plot outlines were always my favorite part of the history of the Lord of the Rings. My favorite moments in these sections, like in the War of the Jewels, in the Grey Annals, what we're reading, is when he actually crossed things out. When we see him cross things out and replace it with something else, I love those passages. Because again, there we can see directions, right? What was he first thinking, and what did he shift it to, and what does that shift tell us? And sometimes, even when it's just one word, it's interesting, right? And we can't build an enormous structure of interpretation on the changing of a single word, but we can take it as one datum, right? And we can use that, combine that with other data, and really begin to see patterns of how Tolkien's story is growing and changing. So anyhow, let's look at some of these examples here. All right. So let's start off with the shift in the matter of Myglin. Chalk this in the category of stuff that I would not even have noticed had it not been for the nature of Middle-earth. If not for the fact that we took a break to read the nature of Middle-earth as soon as it came out, I would never have noticed the significance of this. But it was really fun to notice this, having come from the nature of Middle-earth and what was revealed in that. Okay, so we get a rejected annal for the year 471. In this year, Isfin the White, sister of Turgon, wearying of the city and desiring to look again upon Fingon her brother, went from Gondolin against the will and counsel of Turgon, and she strayed into Brethil and was lost in the dark forest. There Eol, the dark elf, who abode in the forest, found her and took her to wife. In the depths of the wood he lived, and shunned the sun, desiring only the starlight of old, for so he had dwelt since the first finding of Beleriand, and took no part in all the deeds of his kin. Okay, and then that's changed to year 316. 471 before, 316 now. So actually, before we even get into the paragraph, you see the fellow Nature of Middle-earth scholars, you remember the significance here? Why? The biggest change that he makes. These two paragraphs are pretty similar. I mean, there's some differences, which we're going to look at in a second. But by far, the biggest change that he makes is he shifts the time, like radically shifts the time. The thing that he had originally plotted in at year 471, he's like, no, I got to push that back to 316. And like I said, I wouldn't even have, I may not even have, I mean, I might have noticed the difference in the years, but I wouldn't have thought anything of it, right? And now all of a sudden I'm like, oh, yeah, of course. David Michael, exactly. It's all about the aging rates. It's all about the aging rates. Remember that Myglin is the problem child, in more than one sense, of course, but Myglin was the problem child of Tolkien's entire world-building experiment at this point, as he was beginning to really flesh out what is the growth ratio between humans and elves, the growth and maturation ratio between elves and humans. He basically sort of realized that his initial outline, the way that he had originally written things, year 471, that only gives Myglin like 20 years to mature before all of a sudden he's supposed to be, macking on Idril in Gondolin, right? And being creepy. And he was like, that can't be. So he had to push it back in order to give Myglin time to grow up. Myglin was the most time critical because every other elf, is that true? You'll notice a pattern in my speech. Whenever I'm talking spontaneously like this and I catch myself using the words always, every, or never in a sentence, I often pause immediately afterwards. And that's just me doing my, is this true? I'm just making a pretty sweeping statement right here. So yes, I believe it is true that every other elf who takes a significant role in the stories of the Silmarillion, at least could potentially have been born in Valinor or earlier on. That is, the dates of their conception don't create a bound for their ages. So with everybody else, he's able to fudge. He's got much more fudge factor built in when he's trying to figure out the aging rates and stuff. Almost everybody else, like Galadriel, lots of fudge factor. She's born in Valinor at some point, right? And exactly when is fungible, right? But Myglin, his conception is part of the story. And it's a story that doesn't happen until not just they're in Beleriand, but they have to have been in... Gondolin has to exist already. And that doesn't happen straight away, right? So he had some serious plot constraints involved in the Myglin story. And so Myglin was the most challenging, the most difficult story to reconcile with the world building that he was trying to do in figuring out the elvish aging rates. So David Michael, I also did not notice the not wholly unwilling line. There are several things that we can see there. One thing I would remind folks of, this is a trend that we had noticed when we were reading the early material, when we were reading the annals of Aman and stuff in Morgoth's Ring. So remember that Morgoth's Ring and the War of the Jewels, although they're sequential in the History of Middle-earth series, remember they're not sequential chronologically, right? He didn't write the Morgoth's Ring stuff and then write the War of the Jewels stuff. The War of the Jewels stuff and the Morgoth's Ring stuff are the same stuff, written at the same times, in the same bunches of times, right? It's just that between volume 10 and 11, Christopher has distinguished them by subject matter, right? The Beleriand stuff and the Valinor stuff. I did that backwards. The Valinor stuff in Morgoth's Ring, the Beleriand stuff in War of the Jewels, rather than by the chronology of their composition by Tolkien. So, in other words, what that means is some of the trends that we were noticing were happening through the writing of the revision of the Silmarillion material from Aman that we were reading in Morgoth's Ring. That those trends are going to be relevant because they're happening at the same time here, right? So you may remember that one of the trends that we were looking at that I was very interested in Morgoth's Ring when we were reading the Aman material was his noticeable beefing up of women. Not just the number of women. This is the moment when all the wives and sisters get added in, and we find out that Fingolfin had daughters. It's there's a whole bunch of things that we learn, right? No, wait, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Finwë, that Finwë had daughters. Anyway, the point is all these girls start showing up, and not just women who are being mentioned, but also he goes back and he starts beefing up their roles and sort of talking about them differently. And I started to notice it, and I was like, I was hesitant at first when I began noticing the pattern in Morgoth's Ring. And the reason I was hesitant is that I'm always hesitant when I'm seeing what appears to me at first like evidence to support a modern interest. That is, the number of female characters in Tolkien's writing and the roles that female characters play in Tolkien's writings. That is very much a modern focus, right? Like many people in the last 20 years, have been very focused on that question. And so knowing that, like, anything that we are kind of obsessed about, but I don't have, clear contemporary evidence to think that Tolkien himself was obsessed about it too, I'm always a little hesitant, because it's very easy to end up taking our own interests, the questions that we find really interesting, and read them back into, and like assume that Tolkien was interested in those same questions too. And so it felt like that to me. I was like, well, okay, we are interested in the question of female characters in Tolkien. Did he really think about it that much? I mean, is what we're seeing actually evidence that Tolkien did have a moment in his writing where he was like, you know what? I've neglected the female characters. I should rectify that. I mean, that's interesting. And like, it would be cool if that were true, but it was almost like too cool, if you know what I mean. Like, so I was hesitant when I was talking about that. But as we were looking at it more and more, as we were continuing to explore Morgoth's Ring, it kept coming up again and again, and I became convinced. I think it's actually a thing. I think it's real. I think that in this phase, in this period, though I'm not sure in retrospect whether it was necessarily in the early 50s period, like this initial phase after the writing of the Lord of the Rings, or in the later phase. I think it might have been the later phase. We'll have to see if we see any more of this here moving forward. But in any case, in the post Lord of the Rings period, there did seem to be a trend here. So all of this, this entire digression, David Michael Roberts, is your fault. You were pointing about that not wholly unwilling line. One of the things that we were seeing were allusions to Arethel. I believe after her name was changed from Isfin to Arethel, which inclines me to believe this is still early. This is still the that first phase, first post Lord of the Rings phase that we're reading, and so she's still Isfin the White. Her name will change to Arethel a little bit later on. I'm just teasing you, David Michael. You didn't do anything wrong. I just like to be able to blame other people when I digress. So I think it was when her name changes to Arethel that he comes and he beefs up the story from her perspective, right? Gives us more of her own experience there. So I would guess that might be part of that. Anyhow, okay. Now let's read the paragraph and look at some of the directions, some of the specific things that he's looking at. Yes, like things like "I am your sister, not your servant." Well, actually, hang on, David Michael. Just stepping back a moment, giving her lines. She gets no lines here, right? We don't know what she was thinking. All we're told is that she was wearying of the city, right? We get this one participial phrase, right? Isfin the White, sister of Turgon, wearying of the city, and desiring to look again upon Fingin, her brother, went from Gondolin against the will and counsel of Turgon, right? Like, what is she thinking? What's going on? So yes, the conversation that we get between Turgon and Arethel, in which she says things like, "I am your sister, not your servant," right? That's not here, right? We're not getting that yet. But anyway, okay. As I say, let's look at the let's do some close comparison. Tell me what you notice when he apart from the change of the date. What else does he shift? Here Isfin the White, sister of Turgon, wearying of the city, went from Gondolin against the will, changed to wish, of Turgon. And she went not to Fingon, as he bade, but sought the ways to the east, to the land of Celegorm and his brethren, her friends of old in Valinor. But she strayed from her escort in the shadows of Nan Dungorthin, and went on alone, and she came at last to Nan Elmoth. There she came into the enchantments of Eol the Dark Elf, who abode in the wood and shunned the sun, desiring only the starlight of old. And Eol took her to wife, and she abode with him, and no tidings of her came to any of her kin, for Eol suffered her not to stray far, nor to fare abroad, save in the dark or the twilight. Okay, it's longer, right? That's one thing that we can notice, and that is a very simple observation, obviously, but it's significant, right? There's much more story there. The first version, it's really just 2 data points, really. Isfin the White wearies of the city and leaves Gondolin. Point number 1. Point number 2, Eol found her and took her to wife. And then we get a little bit of information about who Eol was. That's it. Right, that's what we get the first time. Notice how much more story, how much more narrative we get when he comes back to it. We get more about her motivations. We get what happens to her in between, like after she leaves and before she arrives. The business about being separated from her escort in the shadows of Nan Dungorthin and going on alone, right? We get what happens to her afterwards, the taking to wife part. Eol suffering her not to stray far, nor to fare abroad save in the dark or the twilight. That's a new piece as well, right? So we're definitely getting a lot more there in the revised version, in the second version there. But apart from the mere bulk of edition, right? What is the direction? So first of all, I always say that I like my eyes always perk up, right, when I see crossouts. Here's a fun one. He crosses out will and changes it to wish. He originally writes, went from Gondolin against the will of Turgon, which of course is interesting because that's exactly what he said in the first version too. Went from Gondolin against the will and counsel of Turgon. And he changes, and then writing it the second time, he writes, went from Gondolin against the will of Turgon. But then he changes will to wish. What does that suggest? Again, you have to be a little careful. You can't build elaborate structures on this kind of change, right? It's very likely that if we're trying to guess, we're trying to get inside Tolkien's head and figure out exactly why he made this one word change, we're probably, we're very likely to be wrong. But that doesn't mean it's not fun, and it doesn't mean it's not okay to think about. We just have to, put it in brackets and make sure we're not making too much of it. But against the will of Turgon to against the wish of Turgon. What are things that you notice about that change? How does that shift from will to wish seem to you to change the kind of tenor and it's important because this initial sentence is the topic sentence of the whole thing, right? This is what it's the frame in a sense of the entire story that's gonna follow. JJ, yes, will is stronger and forceful, whereas wish is more just counsel. He didn't want it. This is not Turgon's plan either way, right? But it's the difference between she is going against the will of Turgon or she's just going against his wish. Is it just his preference or is it his command, right? Yes, going against his will is defiance. Agreed. Whereas going against his wish is merely disappointment. Yeah. Emily, I agree. Will makes it sound more like a domestic violence situation, or at least domestic control, right? It's like he is Turgon is asserting his will over Isfin. Now, I mean, he is king, nobody handed him a sword out of any body of water, but still, he is king. So there's like some excuse for his will to be law, because it kind of is, because he's sort of king. But nevertheless, you're right. It does, changing from will to wish. Not only it changes the dynamics between them, it puts it into a more family dynamic situation than it does a subject defying her king kind of situation, right? It doesn't sound anymore like she's committing treason. Exactly. Yeah. And notice how we can almost hear a fore echo of that line, the dialogue that she is going eventually to be given, right? I am your sister, not your servant. Changing will to wish is kind of, in one word alteration, kind of an assertion that she is his sister, not his servant. And yes, Marianne, of course, you are certainly right that Eäl's treatment of her is certainly domestic violence. Absolutely. And notice how that gets emphasized much more, right? In the same paragraph in which the will of Turgon is made to sound less despotic, the despotism of Eäl's will is elevated, right? All we learned in that first version is that she was found and taken to wife. How'd that go down? What'd she think of that? Right? Now, we're still not told exactly what she thought of that. The extent to which, is this a rape? Is this, is there coercion here? Is this very romantic? It's possible. You can't, just from this paragraph alone, or from that first paragraph alone, we couldn't absolutely rule out. That could have, there Eäl, the dark elf, abode in the forest, found her and took her to wife. Hey, that could be like the plot of a Disney movie for all we know, right? Not that isn't sometimes creepy too, but you know what I mean, right? But again, notice how he doesn't change that on the one hand. He doesn't tell us about her willingness to become his wife. But what he does tell us is some circumstantial evidence of how she was treated as wife afterwards. Eäl suffered her not to stray far. And of course, that is such an explicit reflection of Turgon not wanting her to stray far from Gondolin, right? The kind of symmetry of Isfin's domestic situation is really emphasized in that second version of the story, isn't it? Right? How she goes from a situation that she was wearying of to one which is a good deal worse, right? And notice, of course, that she's gone from... we're not given any details about Gondolin here, but it's hard not to think that she's gone from the city of light and glory to now being constrained even more strongly and constrained to the dark and the twilight. Eäl's thing for the darkness didn't sound... Shunned the sun is not a good look, right? That's it. There's no question. He shunned the sun is a red flag, right? Definitely. Makes him sound slightly orcish, right? Just on the orcish side of things, right? But desiring only the starlight of old, that's okay, right? I get it. Living in the depths of the wood, desiring only the starlight of old, right? I guess he's not rolling with the times, but you can, again, we're left with that first paragraph kind of wondering about Eäl, right? Is he a bad guy? He's a dark elf, which doesn't sound good either. But the darkness isn't evil necessarily, especially the starlight of old was totally not evil. So, whereas again, now that gets recontextualized. We get the same thing, who abode in the wood and shunned the sun, desiring only the starlight of old. But when that's immediately followed up with the dark or the twilight being the prison of Isfin, right? And it's not just that Eol is holding himself apart and taking no part in all the deeds of his kin. Maybe he's shy. He's just an introvert, right? Who are we to judge? But instead now of Eol taking no part in the deeds of his kin, now Isfin, no tidings of her came to any of her kin, right? She is being kept. And even word of her, when she strayed from her escort and was lost alone, her kin is presumably worried about her, right? But he keeps news. He prevents her from returning to her kin and keeps even tidings of her from getting to her kin. And that is now in a totally different category than took no part in the deeds of his kin. Yes. Okay. Anyway. See, isn't this fun? I love passages like this. This is like when we get a whole paragraph struck out and replaced. That's like candy, right? Oh man. But you see how we can see the direction in which the story is growing, right? Eol's character is growing. Turgon's character is shifting a little bit. Isfin's character is growing substantially, right? And that's fun. That's interesting. Okay. Another thing, this is not one of those passages where we get two passages to compare, but this is one instead where we get an early version of a character which is very familiar to us from the Silmarillion, but is nowhere yet near where that character is going to be. And this, of course, is Haleth. One of everybody's. I mean, look, I bet you that there are many of you. I was mentioning before the way in which so many modern readers focus on the question, because it's a perfectly fair and interesting question of the representation of women in Tolkien and the number of female characters and stuff. And I bet you that there are many people who are listening to this broadcast right now who have had conversations on this topic with other people, possibly conversations on this topic with Tolkien hostile people who were making sweeping claims about Tolkien being a misogynist or something. And that further, I conjecture that many people here might have attempted to rebut those claims about Tolkien's misogyny or the paucity of female characters in Tolkien with salient examples from the Silmarillion, right? Have you ever said something like, well, you want female characters in Tolkien, you should read the Silmarillion, okay? Because, I mean, there you got some, you want your strong female characters, right? You got a bunch of those in the Silmarillion. And, of course, among those strong female characters in the Silmarillion, the character of Haleth stands tall, right? I mean, she would be on the short list. Luthien, generally top of the list of strong female characters that people are interested in the Silmarillion. But Haleth is definitely on the short list, right? So what do we notice when the character of Haleth is invented, which this is the beginning. This paragraph right here is the origin of the Haleth character. And Haleth is a dude, originally. In this year, Haleth the Hunter came into Beleriand out of Eriador. Soon after also came Hador the Golden-Haired with great companies of men. Haleth remained in Sirian's Vale, and his folk wandered much in hunting, owning allegiance to no prince. But their dwellings were deep in the forest of Brethil, between Teiglin and Sirian, where none before had dwelt because of the greatness and darkness of the trees. Hador, hearing there was room and need of folk in Hithlum, and being come of a Northland people, became a vassal of Fingolfin, and he strengthened greatly the armies of the king, and he was given wide lands in Hithlum, in the country of Dor-Lomin. There was ever great love between the Eldar and the house of Hador, and the folk of Hador were the first men to forsake their own tongue and speak the elven tongue of Beleriand. Okay, so before we do comparison and contrast, we don't get much here, right? So the first thing to observe, before we even observe Haleth's masculinity, right? The even more prominent, I mean, that's kind of hard to miss, right? But the even more prominent thing is how short the story is, right? I mean, what's Haleth's story? Well, his story is he came into Beleriand leading a bunch of people. He was a hunter, and he remained in Sirian's Vale. They owned allegiance to no prince, and their dwellings were deep in the forest of Brethil. So they get situated in the forest of Brethil. Their independence is noted, right? Unlike the people of Hador, which he's going to go on to explain about, they don't become the vassal of any of the elven kings. So they live in Brethil, they remain independent, and they're led by a random dude named Haleth, about whom we know nothing apart from the fact that he is apparently a hunter. And so therefore his folk wander much in hunting. That's it. No further story. No, battle at the palisade and the tragic death of the leaders of this people. No wanderings across Beleriand. No interaction with the elves. No, that we're told, right? As far as we know from this paragraph, they never even met any elves. I'm sure they met some, right? But we never hear about how they interacted with them, apart from the purely negative piece of information. They didn't swear fealty to any of them, right? We certainly get no, journey through Dungortheb, the survival of which was a marvel to many people. Yeah, no Doriath entry denial, all that stuff. Yep, exactly. And yes, this paragraph really is 3 sentences. I think, no, 4 sentences in the paragraph. Oh no, wait, 5. Yeah, we got it. But anyway, not very many. There's some long sentences in here. And actually, glad you noticed that, David Michael, because that's going to become relevant in a few slides. Just 3 for Haleth. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, just 3 for Haleth. So apart from the fact, so the future of Haleth, right? The future of Haleth and the Haladin is, on the one hand, they're never going to lose these things, right? Associations with hunting, though that's going to be de-emphasized a little bit. Their final settlement in the forest of Brethil, and their independent spirit, right? Their non-political alignment with anybody else. Those things are totally going to be there. But he's not going to stray from those things, but he's going to add a very great deal. And in the addition, Haleth is going to become a woman. Same name, which is itself interesting. How many of you, the first time you ever saw the Peter Jackson films, kind of were surprised when that young boy at Helm's Deep is given the name Haleth? Perfectly appropriate, right? Good Rohirric name. Good Rohirric boy name, Haleth, right? But if you knew the Silmarillion, it might have been a little bit of a jolt, right? Because we have a lot of associations with the name Haleth, because she's a very memorable character, and female in the Silmarillion. But it's a boy's name. And yet, exactly, Helm Hammerhand's son was called Haleth. That's why it's so appropriate. And a fine choice by Peter Jackson's crew to meet a young boy who is named after the son of Helm Hammerhand, one of the sons who did not live through the Fellwinter and the siege. Anyhow, So yeah, totally appropriate. But he's shifted. So without changing the name, which he might have done, he makes the character female, and is going to greatly expand her story. So yeah, is this another one of those examples that I was talking about? Can we see again, both in Isfin/Arethel and in Haleth, once again, Tolkien coming back at a later time, and I am now more and more convinced that it was phase 2, that later stage, not the early burst of writing immediately after finishing The Lord of the Rings, when he was still hoping to get the Silmarillion published, but the later rewritings, when he begins to go back and add in the women and deepen, and even in this case transform, take a character who was already there as a man, though a man who only gets 3 sentences, and turn it into a female character. So he gender switches Haleth, and then expands her story, and then makes her story into a really interesting and compelling story. So that's a fascinating little glimpse. Okay, let's keep going. Oh, come on. This is awesome. How awesome is this? In his last throw, Fingolfin pinned the foot of his enemy to the earth with Ringil, and the black blood gushed forth and filled the pits of Grond. Of course, we're at the end of the duel with Fingolfin and Morgoth. Morgoth went ever halt thereafter. Now, lifting the body of the fallen king, he would break it and cast it to his wolves. But Thorondor coming suddenly, assailed him and marred his face, and snatching away the corse of Fingolfin, bore it aloft to the mountains far away, and laid it in a high place, north of the valley of Gondolin. There the eagles piled a great cairn of stones. There was lamentation in Gondolin when Thorondor brought the tidings, for the people of the hidden city were all changed to, for many of the people of the hidden city were Noldor of Fingolfin's house. Now Rochalor had stayed beside the king until the end, but the wolves of Angband assailed him. This is, of course, his horse, Fingolfin's horse. And he escaped from them because of his great swiftness, and ran at last to Hithlum, and broke his heart, and died. Then in great sorrow, Fingon took the leadership of the house of Fingolfin and the kingdom of the Noldor. Later penciled addition, but his young son, Findor, possibly, changed to Gilgalad, he sent to the Havens. Okay. So first of all, the second ride of Rochalor, oh man, come on. That is, why did we lose that? Oh, the tragedy of the thing. The detail about his horse faithfully remaining by him. So like there with Fingolfin against Morgoth, none stood by him except his horse, man. His horse stays with him throughout. And then only flees when Fingolfin is dead, and escaping the wolves runs back to Hithlum and dies of a broken heart. Whether instantly or... I mean, I'm kind of imagining him galloping into Hithlum and dropping dead. But there might have been some time that passed. I don't really know for sure. So I, first of all, just kind of love that detail. This is another thing, by the way. Notice how this tracks with the we've commented, I mean, we've made lots of jokes about this in the past. How much better the horses fare in The Lord of the Rings than in The Hobbit, right? I mean, talk about your minor roles that you don't want to get cast in, right? Pony in The Hobbit, worst gig ever, right? All of the ponies in the ponies in The Hobbit get at twice, right? So I mean, it's yeah, they are equine red shirts in The Hobbit, absolutely. But But he, in the Lord of the Rings, the survival of Bill the Pony, just the contrast between Bill the Pony and the Hobbit ponies, for one, how much more interest he shows in the story of the horses, even comparatively minor horses like Hazafel and Arod. Really cool. I mean, it's a very noticeable development of Tolkien's storytelling tendencies. And here, coming right after The Lord of the Rings, right? The new world of increased equine sensitivity in storytelling, right? We get this extra sentence about Roquelaure that was never in any of the other stories. Yes, the great love of Fingolfin and Roquelaure. That's the epic poem that you want to read, Meow? Yeah, I bet you there are minstrels who sang that song. So that's really fun. Okay, what else? What else do we see? Well, here are some more changes that we get. Let's talk about the is this the first mention of Gil-galad? Yeah, think so. I think we're getting Gil-galad here. Remember, this is all the stuff that we're reading in this book is after The Lord of the Rings, right? So he is now motivated to situate Gil-galad in the history of the First Age, which he was not before. The story of the Last Alliance was an old story. It was part of the Numenor story when the Numenor story first began to emerge, which is a while back. I mean, it was in like the 20s and 30s that was emerging. So the seeds of but like who exactly, the identity of the last king of the elves. So like the mythic concept of the last king of the elves and this great king of men joined together in a thing mythically called the Last Alliance, which has all of this, mythic ramifications for like the passing away of the elder days of Middle-earth and everything else, right? Anyway, so that concept, the concept of the Last Alliance, is an old concept. The character of Gil-galad in particular, as it's developed in The Lord of the Rings, is very, very much newer. In fact, it wasn't too long before he wrote The Lord of the Rings that he was still imagining Elrond to be the Elven King who fought at the Last Alliance. Anyway, so yes, we should pay attention to Gil-galad stuff, because that's all sort of new here. And yes, he is kind of crowbarring Gil-galad in, just as he's crowbarring Galadriel in, who was invented during the writing of The Lord of the Rings, right? So there are a couple figures that he now is motivated to go back and find, to read them backwards into the story of the First Age without doing too much violence to the stories of the First Age. So we've already seen him working Galadriel into the Thingol and Melian story, and now we're seeing him working Gil-galad in to the Fingolfin story. Okay, so yes, that is another interesting thing that we see. Why does he situate him with Fingon in particular? Well, Sylvan, the impulse seems to simply be a patrilinear one. That is to say, line of the kings, right? Fingolfin, the High King, and his son Fingon, and his son Gil-galad, right? So to have Gil-galad, that first impulse seems to be to place the mantle of high kingship as his destiny. He is in the direct line of Fingolfin, who has just had his very epic ending, right? Accompanied by his very epic horse. So we can see this seems to be his first answer to the question. So where does Gil-galad fit in? Here it is, right? Line of the kings. Connect him with Fingolfin in the high kingship from the jump, right? And he's even being sent away to the havens as the obvious. He's like the spare king. He's being set aside, like literally set aside from the rest of the elves. Like the elves themselves, Fingon himself is setting Gil-galad aside to protect him, right? To make sure that he can inherit someday. In case something, on the offhand chance that there's some kind of hideous slaughter and that Fingon is going to be killed, there shall still remain a high king among the elves in the line of Fingolfin, and he's going to be safe. So Gil-galad is like the spare, right? And is being treated like the spare. Yeah. Well, David, he's not forgetting about Turgon. Of course, the high kingship passing to Turgon. Well, it's complicated. We'll get there. Maybe. We'll talk about Turgon later. But yeah, no, that's, remember Gil-galad wasn't there in the earlier versions. So the idea of the progression from Fingolfin to Fingon to Turgon was a natural one in the early versions. Like there wasn't anybody else. And anyway, ending up with Turgon being the high king of the Noldor was very desirable for other story reasons too. In that, in the latter phases of the narrative, that is the latter shape of the story of the first age of Middle-earth, Gondolin is the key, right? Gondolin is the keystone of the end of the arch, right? Of the end of the latter days of the first age, and so that Turgon should be at the political and story plot center of that. Totally worked, right? It was totally important. Anyhow, let's but we'll come back to Turgon. Small point, but an interesting little one. Did you notice the way the description of Morgoth's wound is different here from the one that's in the published Silmarillion? There's a lot here that we're getting, like, that we're recognizing straight from the final text, but there is a detail which is not the way it is in the published Silmarillion, and that is, in his last throw, Fingolfin pinned the foot of his enemy to the earth with Ringo. Does anybody remember what it says in the published text? In the published Silmarillion, what does Fingon do to Morgoth's foot? Do you remember? Anybody remember the verb? What does he do to it? Close, Fëanor. He hews it. That's it, Spunky. That's it. He hews his foot. Where is he? Yeah, that's it. You guys are getting it on Twitch there too. Yep. He hews his foot. He's pinned under Morgoth's foot. Morgoth's foot is resting on his person at this point. Right. So simply, I think this is Tolkien reading through this and being like, yeah, actually, it doesn't make sense. If a giant is crushing you to the ground with his foot, you could Shelob's underbelly his foot, maybe, from underneath, right? If you wanted to transfix the foot with Ringo. But you couldn't pin it to the earth with Ringo. I mean, what, are you going to reach around the giant's foot and stab it down, through your own body and into the ground? Like, way too awkward. Like, doesn't really work. This is a very small thing, but I'm interested in it because how does Tolkien get himself into that problem in the first? I think this is it's a legitimate problem, right? Which Tolkien corrects later on. He seems to think it was a problem too, that like Fingolfin couldn't have done that to Morgoth's foot, not from that position. But I think he gets himself into that position because he was thinking, as is his wont, Tolkien, that is, was thinking mythically rather than practically. Like, what mattered first was the concepts, right? He loved the idea of the foot of Morgoth, crashing down like a hill upon Fingolfin, right? After Fingolfin had, stricken him with 6 wounds, 6 other wounds, right? So Fingolfin's defiance, the wounding of Morgoth, the bearing down of Fingolfin to the ground, the last desperate strike at the foot, and the Morgoth going halt ever thereafter. The visual image of Morgoth's foot being pinned to the earth with Ringo. These were all things that he liked, right? They don't all work together, but they're all cool. And so the mere fact that he's going back later and saying, okay, I've got to make sure that this isn't just cool, it's also practical. This is this is a trend which is more and more visible in his later work, that he tends to be thinking more and more in terms of those kinds of things. This is Tolkien, the I'm going to make a chart of the phases of the moon world builder speaking, I think, there. Okay. One other small detail, and then I'll move on. We got another cross out. Love me some cross outs, right? Notice what's happening in the cross out, because it's actually has big ramifications. It's not that this is the moment where this changes. We've seen other examples of this before, but this is a systematic change he's going through and making. Later on, notice Christopher Tolkien says later changed to. Like, that's what the italicized later means. He doesn't change it to this in the flow at the time. Like, that change from will to wish in Turgon seems to be while he was writing the sentence. Here, he had written, there was lamentation in Gondolin when Thorondor brought the tidings for many of the people, for the people of the hidden city were all Noldor of Fingolfin's house. That's what he wrote originally. But then later on, he goes back and changes that to, there was lamentation for many of the people of the hidden city were Noldor of Fingolfin's house. What has happened is the change of the demographics of Gondolin, that Gondolin now contains. And so you may remember where we saw this before. We were told that Nevrast, Turgon's original city, was a pure Noldorin city. And then that got changed. And in fact, you may remember in the published Silmarillion, we're told almost the opposite of that. That among the people of Turgon, that Turgon's kingdom was one of the places in all of Beleriand where there was the greatest mingling of the Sindar and the Noldor. So he didn't, this isn't just a little change that he makes, it's a total reversal of this thing. Now, so what? So what? What does that show us? Why is that interesting? What is interesting to me about that? Again, Gondolin is enormously important. Gondolin looms very large. Not quite as large as Beren and Luthien or as Turin Turambar. Those are the two biggest stories. But Gondolin casts a long shadow in Tolkien's Legendarium. And of course, Gondolin seems to have come first, or come close to coming first, right? The original Fall of Gondolin story was one of the very first things that he wrote. Probably the first sort of official story of his Legendarium that we get. So Gondolin there's a kind of primacy in Gondolin of its significance in his stories as a whole. So this kind of a shift shows that in his imagination, Gondolin, which is so important, so dominantly important, such that the fall of Gondolin is the critical event in the end of the First Age. He's changed that. In his head, that was a Noldor story. exclusively, straight up, explicitly, Noldor only. And now he is making it into a Sindar Noldor combined story from the start. Right? He's going back and rewriting the whole lead up to Gondolin and then Gondolin itself in order to emphasize the Sindar. Gondolin belongs to the Sindar as well. Turgon is the king. It's Turgon City, right? He's going to become High King of the Noldor. So it's a very Noldoran city still, but the Sindarin have a stake in Gondolin. The Sindar have a stake in Gondolin from the beginning. And that is, I think, a very interesting and important development, especially in the context of what we saw at the beginning of the Grey Annals, of the way in which he has imaginatively invested himself in the life of the Sindar and the experience of the Sindar, and the whole mythic story of the Sindar through Thingol and Melian, right? That story is going to come to a tragic end. The story of the, the Eden of Middle-earth, right? Under the divine Melian, who is like the genius loci of all of Beleriand, and Thingol, who is living the dream, right? Who is doing the Valinor thing properly, right? Joining himself to the Valar and marrying, one of the gods, but staying in Middle Earth, and instead making that into rule of Middle Earth and breathing out joy and all that stuff, right? That story is going to come to a tragic end, but now we get this other parallel outcome story for the Sindar. The Sindar are going to survive. Gondolin is going to be their refuge too. Gondolin is going to be the portal through which the Sindar story continues, just as it is the portal for the survival of so many of the Noldor as well. Yeah, exactly. The Fall of Gondolin was written from hospital when he came back with trench fever. Yeah, so sort of during the war. Yeah. For more on this, John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War, he talks a lot about the Fall of Gondolin, and really excellent stuff there. Okay, let's keep going. Here we go again. Right, it's Christmas morning again. We get a paragraph crossed out and replaced by a replacement paragraph. This time, the backstory of Hurin. So this is a huge deal, right? This is the introduction of Hurin, who is the beginning of the Turin story, right? So, okay, let's do it. Version number 1. It is said that in the autumn before the sudden flame, Hurin, son of Galion, was dwelling as foster son, as the custom was among the northern men, with Haleth, and Hondir and Hurin, being of like age, went much together. And hunting, Hondir is Haleth's son, of course. And hunting in Sirian's Vale, they found by chance or fate, later changed to, they found by fate or the will of Ulmo, the hidden entrance into the city of Tumladen, where stood Gondolin the guarded city. There they were taken by the watch, and brought before Turgon, and looked upon the city, of which none that dwelt outside yet knew aught, save Thorondor, king of eagles. Okay, what's the core story? This initial version of Hurin's backstory. What do we get? Notice we get a cross out, right? Oh man, so cool. Notice the cross out. He went from Hurin is hunting in Sirian's Vale, found by chance or fate. So he's doing his coy, chance if chance it were kind of thing, right? But then he doubles down. He's like, no, I'm not going to be coy about this, right? They found by fate or the will of Ulmo. So he explicitly brings Ulmo into this, right? So I'm going to explain a mechanism, and chance is right out, right? Okay, so Hurin, for a reason which has nothing to do with chance, finds the hidden entrance into Tomb Lawton where Gondolin stands. And they're taken in, and he sees Gondolin, and he's like, wow, okay, all right. So yeah, there's some really interesting things here. We got Hondir and Hurin, right? So, and that's not the story we know from later on. Okay, so let's read the second version, which, surprise, surprise, is longer. There might be examples of occasions when Tolkien rewrites a passage like this and the second version is shorter than the first one, but they are few. They usually grow in the retelling, which is one of the fun things about them. Okay, second version. It is said that at this time, Hurin and Huor, the sons of Galion, were dwelling with Halath, added later their kinsmen, as foster sons, as the custom then was among northern men. And they went both to battle with the orcs, even Huor, for he would not be restrained, though he was but 13 years of age. And being with a company that was cut off from the rest, they were pursued to the ford of Brithiach, and there they would have been taken or slain, but for the power of Ulmo, which was still strong in Syrian. Therefore a mist arose from the river, and hid them from their enemies, and they escaped into Dimbar, and wandered in the hills beneath the sheer walls of the Chrysaegrim. There Thorondor espied them, and sent 2 eagles that took them, and bore them up, and brought them beyond the mountains to the secret vale of Tomb Lawton and the hidden city of Gondolin, which no man else had yet seen. Whew. All right. So, what do you notice? Much more story. So, okay, first obvious thing, right? Poor Hondir gets the boot, right? And we've got Hurin and Huor. The character of Tuor exists, obviously, in the Fall of Gondolin story. So it's not like this is the invention, I don't think, of Huor's character, but the addition, like adding Huor into this story, and not only adding him, he doesn't just get replaced. I mean, Hondir doesn't do much in that first version, right? He's just the companion that Hurin was with. But the replacement of Hondir by Huor, it's not just a substitution. We get more about him, right? Like the fact that he went to battle at the age of 13 because he could not be restrained, right? At the age of 13, Huor is like, let me at him. I'll tear him apart, right? So we don't just get the replacement. We actually get some characterization there from Huor. Notice the emphatic, just as we got that one alteration in the first paragraph from chance or fate to fate or the will of Ulmo. Let's make sure we know that it's fate, but also that Ulmo probably took a hand in this, right? But we don't know how. So they just get lost. They're hunting in the first version. They're hunting, they get lost, and somehow, maybe it was luck, or maybe it was the will of Ulmo, or probably it was fate. They end up finding the hidden entrance, which is, so you're supposed to not be able to do. So that's kind of a big deal. Yeah, we're going to say, no. Let's have Ulmo take a clearer hand in this. Ulmo's fingerprints are all over this thing the second time through. We can't miss it at all. Let's, instead of just having them wandering off hunting, let's have them fighting a battle in which they are miraculously saved. Not by the eagles, which are in fact going to come in, but straight up by Ulmo's power, which is strong in Syrian. This mist rises up and hides them, and they are spirited away. So their life is saved. They are being actively directed by Ulmo. And then, there they go. They get spied by the eagles, and the eagles bring them beyond the mountains into the secret vale of Tumladen, which of course also has the result of meaning he doesn't know how to get in. He doesn't know where the entrance is, right? So there is no chance that Hurin can lead anybody at any point directly to the gate to Gondolin, because he's never seen it, right? He took the express route into Gondolin. Okay, so there's no accident, there's no by chance if chance you call it. It is a miraculous intervention by Ulmo, and then a doubling down on miraculous intervention by having the eagles sweep down and bear them up and bring them into Gondolin. So their arrival in Gondolin is not only a stroke of fate, which is implied even in the first version, but is an active intervention. Ulmo's got plans. Ulmo's up to stuff. And Ulmo is up to stuff is kind of the subtitle of the Gondolin story, right? So that sort of tracks here. The connection and so let me be more explicit about the significance I see there. Hurin's connection to Gondolin might, in the first version, and even to some extent in the published Silmarillion version, seem a little bit incidental, like not a central part of his story, really. But it is clear from the direction of the changes that Tolkien is making here, by him deciding, no. Ulmo has to be not just involved, but this has to be an Ulmo story, right? That shows that this incident is clearly a part of Ulmo's master plan. That recontextualizes this moment of Hurin's backstory into an early stage of Ulmo's master Gondolin plan. Remember, Gondolin's been all about Gondolin from the beginning, right? He's the one who gives Turgon the dream that he should make a hidden city, brings him to Tumladen to show him where to build the hidden city, and is going to later on be sending messengers, tells him, right, shows up in person to Turgon in Nevrast and is like, okay, time to pack up and go now, folks, right? It's an Ulmo story from beginning to end. And then like, oh, and let me give you the measurements for the armor you're supposed to weave, because later on I'm going to send a messenger. Trust me, it'll make sense later. So the anticipation of the Tuor story, all of that is the Ulmo story from the beginning. Tolkien wants Hurin and Huor's visit to Gondolin to be a part of that Ulmo story. And so that's interesting. Let's watch what happens with that as the story of Hurin develops here, and the story of Huor as well. Huor, again, isn't conceptually a new character in that Tuor always did exist. But Huor's his own role definitely develops. We're watching it develop here in part. All right. This was just a little fun fact that I wanted to make sure you didn't miss, because it's pretty awesome. Remember in The Lord of the Rings when Faramir says, the Rohirrim come from men of the elder days who were friendly with the elves, but not from the three houses of the Edain. So he's like, they have nothing to do with the Númenóreans. They're not from the three houses of the Edain, but they're from men who are friendly with the elves. And I remember being a teenager reading this, and when I finally read the Silmarillion, I was super confused. I'm like, Faramir, what are you on about? Like, who are we talking about? They're the Edain, and they're the wicked Easterlings. Who are the Rohirrim related to? If they were elf friends and not the Edain, who are we even talking about? And of course, here's the answer. But Maedhros, knowing the weakness of the Noldor and the elf friends, whereas the pits of Angband seemed to hold store inexhaustible and ever renewed, made alliance with these new-come men, and gave them dwellings both in Lothlan, north of the March of Maedhros, that is, and in the land south of it. The two chieftains that had the greatest followings and authority were named Bor and Ulfang. The sons of Bor were Borlas and Boromir and Borthond, and they followed Maedhros and were faithful. The sons of Ulfang, the Swart, were Ulfast and Ulwarth and Uldor the Accursed, and they followed Cranthir and swore allegiance to him and were faithless. Footnote: it was afterthought that the people of Ulfang were already secretly in the service of Morgoth ere they came to Beleriand. Not so the people of Bor, who were worthy folk and tillers of the earth. Of them, it is said, came the most ancient of the men that dwelt in the north of Eriador in the Second Age and, read, in after days. In other words, that's where the Rohirrim come from. From the people of Bor. Of the two groups of people who allied themselves with Maedhros for the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the ones who did not betray them. Not of the three kindred of the Edain, not the people of Haleth, not the people of Hador, not the people of Beor, but not the people of Ulfang the Accursed either. Also Breelanders, I suspect, yes. Well, the people of Bor are Easterlings. Easterlings in the sense of that they come from east of Beleriand, which is everywhere, right? Everywhere in Middle-earth is east of Beleriand. So I don't take the word Easterling. I mean, I don't know how seriously. I mean, like how Easter are we talking about here, right? Are we talking about from what in later Middle-earth we would call Rhûn? Or, I mean, like, the Grey Havens is kind of east of Beleriand here. So, yeah. But yes, I do suspect the Breelanders are also probably involved there. The Dunlendings, maybe, but I think not necessarily the Dunlendings, because it says that dwelt in the north of Eriador in the Second Age, and the Dunlendings are in the south of Eriador. So I don't think he's necessarily asserting a relationship, but I mean there may be eventually, or go back far enough, and I'm sure they are. But both Bree and blanking. I hate it when this happens. The land where the Rohirrim lived, it was the Eotheod. That's the word I was blanking on. The people of the Eotheod before they came down, before Eorl the Young brought them down, them and the Breelanders, I think, would both count as living in the north of Eriador. But anyway, at the very least, I feel confident that this is the lore that Faramir has in mind when he makes that comment about the origins, that rather offhand comment about the origins of the Rohirrim. Okay. All right. The Baron and Luthien story. I tried to be selective and not go through the entire Baron and Luthien story together here, because we've had many other opportunities to do that. There are just a few passages that really jumped out at me, and here's a huge one. the departure of Finrod from Nargothrond. Then Finrod changed to Inglor, cast off his crown, and made ready to go forth alone with Beren. But 10 of his most faithful knights stood beside him, and Edrahil, their chief, lifted the crown and bade the king give it in keeping to Orodreth his brother. But Celegorn said, "Know this, thy going is vain, for could ye achieve this quest, it would avail nothing. Neither thee nor this man should we suffer to keep or to give a Silmaril of Feanor. Against thee would come all the brethren to slay thee rather. And should Thingol gain it, then we would burn Doriath or die in the attempt, for we have sworn our oath." "I also have sworn an oath," said Felagund, "and I seek no release from it. Save thine own until thou knowest more. But this I will say to you, son of Feanor changed to Celegorn the Fell, by sight that is given me in this hour, that neither thou nor any son of Feanor shall regain the Silmarils ever until the world's end. And this that we now seek shall come indeed, but never to your hands. Nay, your oath shall devour you, and deliver to other keeping the bride price of Luthien." Whew. That's a lot. Both Celegorm, who is still Celegorn with an N, and I'm not going to make a big deal of that. Notice many of the sons of Feanor's names are still in flux. Celegorn, Cronthir, Mydros with a D, right? Yeah. Anyway, they're kind of chatty here. We got some spoiler action going down here. First, we get heavy foreshadowing of the fall of Doriath, right? We would burn Doriath. Should Thingol gain it, then we would burn Doriath or die in the attempt. Or, his grandson, one or the other. And then you get Inglor, Felagund, just straight up telling us what's going to happen at the end. Not only does he say the stuff about like you're not ever going to any of you end up with Silmarils, but he says this Silmaril. So by the way, Beren is totally succeeding in this quest, right? He just drops that, right? Like, we're totally getting a Silmaril. It's going to happen. Take it to the bank, right? With the sight that is given me in this hour, I can tell. We're totally, book it. We're getting a Silmaril. But the Silmaril that we get is never going to come to your hands. You can forget about it. You can do whatever you want. You can threaten as many kinslayings as you want to threaten, burn down as many forests as you want to burn down, set fire to the Sindar Garden of Eden if you want, but you're never getting a Silmaril. You're never getting this Silmaril. This Silmaril shall be delivered. The bride price of Luthien will be delivered to other keeping, right? So there we are. There we are. Right now, it is not uncommon. I said that very, very rarely do we see Tolkien rewriting a passage and it comes out shorter, and that's true. It's very uncommon. But there is one way in which that does sometimes happen, and that is when he's not rewriting, but actually revising. The distinction being not I'm going through the whole story and I'm rewriting it all, but I'm just going through and I'm making corrections. Like I'm not writing a new document. I'm, crossing things out and writing things in the margin of the original one, right? When he does that, he often reduces his impulse when he's first working it out, like when the story kind of first comes to him. which once people start talking often happens, they usually talk a lot. They spell everything out because this is him seeing the story for the first time. This scene has all of the earmarks. Now, he knows what's going to happen to the Silmaril, to the bride price of Luthien, right? Eärendil, Eärendil and the pimping of his ride is already very much in his mind for the future, right? He knows the fate of the bride price of Luthien. That one, that's locked in. But yeah, I don't even know whether or not, as Fanaro's Pizza was asking, would that mean that Maglor and Maedhros never get the Silmarils in this version? I think it's possible. I think that he is not anticipating that moment yet here. And is possibly one of the reasons that this passage got changed, right? That this prophecy of Finrod gets taken out. But as I say, it's not uncommon for him to have these kinds of plot ideas. And then he, then when he goes through and revises later, he's like, let me not spell everything out quite so heavy-handedly as that. Right. So that's a trend that we notice that lots of times in the history of the Lord of the Rings. So it's the one way in which sometimes things do come out shorter is when he decides to cut down on some of their spelling everything out. And boy, this, the oath duel, Maureen, as you say, the oath duel and the foreshadowing fight, right, between Finrod and Celegorn is intense. It's intense here. One more. Oh, this is so much fun. One of the things that's also fun to see. Here's one of the things that I was enjoying about this synopsis of the Beren and Luthien story. Tolkien is clearly trying to restrain himself. This is one of the places, the Beren and Luthien section, is one of the places where it is most obvious. In answer to the question, what does Tolkien think he's doing? It's one of the places that makes it most clear that he has not yet decided that this is just going to be the Quenta. And that's because he's skipping over, but this is clearly not designed to be a full version of the Beren and Luthien story. It's a weird kind of hybrid. The summary of the Beren and Luthien story that he gives in the Grey Annals here is too much detail for just a pure synopsis, right? So in this year, the Beren and Luthien stuff happened. You know what I'm talking about, right? He could have done a version of that, right? Which for the sake of just keeping an annals to keep track of dates, that would have worked, right? Want to know more about the Beren and Luthien story? You've got several other options, right? Go read the Quenta Silmarillion, or for extra credit, go read the Way of Luthien. But he doesn't do that. He spells out almost every stage of their story, but he does not tell the whole story. And in fact, you will have noticed that many really important and prominent moments in it get really slimmed down and skimmed over. Like he didn't even mention the song duel between Finrod and Sauron, right? He just and then Finrod gets taken captive, right? I mean, there was no hint at the awesome song battle between Finrod and Sauron, which is such a big deal that in later versions he quotes the entire poetic version, as we get in the published Silmarillion from the Way of Luthien. Anyway, so he's doing this sort of weird middle ground where he's not just giving a one paragraph placeholder for the story, but he's definitely not telling the whole story. There is no way that he intends this retelling of the Beren and Luthien story to be anybody's stand-in for the whole, right? But yet, he's writing a very shortened version of it. So what does he think he's doing? Why do it in the middle ground? Well, listen to this. See if you can notice the patterns. The sound. Notice the rhythm of this text. Then Beren and Luthien fled, but at the gate they found Carcharoth once more awake, and he leaped upon Luthien, and before she could use any art, Beren sprang before, and would daunt the wolf with the hand that held the Silmaril. But Carcharoth seized the hand and bit it off, and straightway the Silmaril burned him, and madness seized him, and he fled away, but his howls roused all the sleepers in Angband. Then Luthien knelt by Beren, as he lay in a swoon as it were of death, and all their quest seemed in ruin. But even as she drew forth the venom from Beren's wound with her lips, Thorondor came with Landroval and Gwaihir, his mightiest vassals, and they lifted up Luthien and Beren, and bore them south, high over Gondolin, and set them down on the borders of Doriath. Do you hear the way that his sentences are structured? Notice it reminds you of a bit from the Lord of the Rings text. It certainly does. The bit that it's reminding you of is the charge of Theoden into the Battle of Pelennor Field. And that is exactly correct, JJ. And what you are hearing that is reminding you is Tolkien's shift into a radically paratactic syntax in order to tell this story. Paratactic syntax, there's paratactic syntax and hypotactic syntax. A hypotactic sentence is one with subordinate clauses that explains what's going. A paratactic sentence is a series of simple statements joined together by conjunctions only. And notice how this goes. We get a few subordinate clauses like then Beren and Luthien fled. Or then Luthien knelt by Beren as he lay in a swoon as it were of death. We get a few hypotactic elements in this paragraph, but almost everything is strung together by ands and buts. Then Beren and Luthien fled, but at the gate they found Carcharoth once more awake, and he leaped upon Luthien, and before she could use any art, Beren sprang before, and would daunt the wolf with the hand that held the Silmaril. But Carcharoth seized the hand, and bit it off, and straightway the Silmaril burned him, and madness seized him, and he fled away, but his howls roused. Right, again and again and again. Thorondor came, and Gwaihir, and they lifted up Luthien, and bore them south, high over Gondolin, and set them down on the borders of Doriath. Exactly, David. And the hosts of Mordor wailed, and terror took them, and they fled, and died, and the hoofs of wrath rode over them. That is exactly the passage that this reminds you of. One of the most remarkably paratactic paragraphs when Tolkien really is deliberately modulating into that mode. Now, what's interesting about this? I was really struck by this paratactic paragraph in this dramatic moment, right, at this important moment in the Beren and Luthien story. And what it tells me, again, remember he's doing neither thing. He's not just giving a 4-sentence placeholder. Then Beren and Luthien happened, and it's pretty cool, and you can read about it elsewhere, but whatever, it happened in this year. And the full prose version where we get the whole story. He's not doing either one of those things. So what is he doing? What does he think he's doing? What is Annal accomplishing? Right? And I think we get a hint in this paragraph here. This is a different mode of storytelling. It's not the whole story. This is not like the novella version of Beren and Luthien. What this is more like the version that a bard might retell when someone calls for the short version of Beren and Luthien, right? Tell of Beren and Luthien. But, we've only got half an hour. So, don't give me the whole lay of Leithian, right? But tell of Beren and Luthien, and we get this shortened but still substantial version, and just this breaking into parataxis in this moment. I mean, of course, partly it's just he likes this kind of mode, and it tends to happen in fast-moving action, right? But to me, it feels like a glimpse of this sort of other kind of frame, right? Here's another way of telling the Beren and Luthien story. It's not pretending to be the full story, but it's still a version which is different, and which will hit you differently and will emphasize some different things. But the parataxis here, again, I talked about a bard, telling the story or singing the story, because it feels like that, right? I mean, this kind of rhetorical performance that he's doing here, this kind of transition into parataxis is very deliberate, very noticeable. Right, it's like Beren and Luthien the musical, Emily. Yeah, exactly. Let's do the musical theater version of Beren and Luthien. Yeah, why not? It's not the musical theater version. There'd be way more, dance numbers and way more songs if we got that version here. But it is like that kind of a shift, I think. And so he does seem, in other words, so back to how does this help us answer the question of what does Tolkien think he's doing in writing the annals? Well, one of the things then that he seems to be doing is in fact wanting to give parallel versions of some of these stories, but parallel versions in different modes, right? And that's part of the textual and historical richness of these documents. So when the fortunate public receives the 1,000 pages of Silmarillion material bound together with the 1,000 pages of Lord of the Rings material, all in a big red leather case, which is what Tolkien wanted to do. But for some reason the publishers didn't want to do, because they would have had to charge, they would have confronted readers, the British public, with the choice of purchasing that book or buying a house, essentially. But anyway, what he's, the readers would have gotten this kind of a varied, multi-version kind of text. Okay, last point, and then I'll let you go because it's getting late. Of course, you noticed the eagles at the end. Who picks up Beren and Luthien? Landreval and Gwaihir pick up Beren and Luthien, right? The use in particular of Gwaihir's name. Landreval, that could just be recycling. When Landreval is the name of the, one of the eagles that picks up Frodo and Sam, of course, laying yet another layer of parallelism between Frodo and Sam and Beren and Luthien. Anyway, he, you could say maybe he's just recycling eagle names, right? It's not necessarily the same, Landreval, right? But Gwaihir, no way, man. And especially since, remember, he's writing this right after he wrote The Lord of the Rings. There is no chance. There is no possibility of a chance that the Gwaihir who picks up Luthien and Beren is not the Gwaihir who carries Gandalf around in The Lord of the Rings, right? Same eagle, similar job, right? The continuity that Tolkien is building here. But notice what this means for the eagles in The Lord of the Rings. when you're trying to answer, that question that still hangs around like a bad case of herpes, why didn't the eagles just carry them into Mordor to destroy the ring? The clearest answer to that question is here, right? We can see here very clearly the position that Gwaihir and the eagles are getting. We'll remember that in The Hobbit, the eagles are just, the Lord of the Eagles is just a bird, right? I mean, they, hunt sheep. They quarrel with woodsmen. They're not big fans of the goblins. But they're not noble. They're birds. At the end of the day, they're birds, right? Just from internal evidence alone in The Lord of the Rings, it's pretty clear that Gwaihir the Windlord is operating at a different level than the Lord of the Eagles in The Hobbit. That just as Tolkien's idea of characters like, say, Gandalf have developed considerably since the beginning of The Hobbit, so the character of Gwaihir, the Windlord, very different. Gwaihir the Ringlord, we don't even want to think about that. Anyway, the character of Gwaihir has also developed and changed a very great deal, right? And it's very clear, him placing Gwaihir himself back into the context of the First Age, that Gwaihir is explicitly one of the mightiest vassals of Thorondor. That when we see Gwaihir as the Lord of the Eagles in The Lord of the Rings, he is plainly, now explicitly, the heir of Thorondor of old. And the connection that Thorondor has with Manwë, and the role that Thorondor plays in the stories of the Silmarillion, all of that is being mapped forward onto Gwaihir. It is very, very clear that the eagles are not birds, just birds, that they are Maiar, right? That they are spirits of Manwë. And I think that's very, very cool. Even the mere fact that Gwaihir is obviously millennia old, right? That he's been around since Beren and Luthien and is still around to help pick up Frodo and Sam at the eruption of Mount Doom, shows that he's not a normal eagle, right? Yep. Anyway, so yes, Gwaihir the Ringlord is a pretty good reason for the eagles not to simply fly Frodo to Mordor. Yeah, exactly. Yes, David Michael, I do think if we're trying to reconcile, as Feanaros Pizza was saying, reconcile the Hobbit eagles with the Lord of the Rings eagles, our best bet is that Bilbo himself would have blushed to reread that part, that Bilbo just didn't understand. But anyway, yeah, it's tricky. It is, well, Jeremy, you say, is it a retcon thing or an intentional thing? It's intentionally retconned. I mean, yeah, like he's remember, he's written The Lord of the Rings, so everything Gwaihir does in The Lord of the Rings is out there, right? That eagles swooped and picked up Beren and Luthien has been part of the Beren and Luthien story since before he wrote The Lord of the Rings, right? So the only innovation here is he's connecting those two dots. There were always eagles picking up Beren and Luthien. Now that eagle is identified with that. And by the way, you realize what this means? Allow me to blow your mind for a second, because it blew my mind when I first thought about it this way. Frodo and Sam getting picked up by the eagles isn't a reference to the Beren and Luthien story. Beren and Luthien getting picked up by the eagles is a reference to the Frodo and Sam story, right? Or at least that's how it gets turned by having Gwaihir involved, right? He is now deliberately patterning. He's deliberately connecting the Beren and Luthien story within the Beren and Luthien story to Frodo and Sam, and not just the other way around. Kind of fun. They absolutely are in the same tale still, Yarrow. Absolutely. We know nothing about the relationship between Thorondor and his vessels, like whether he's the sire like Draugluin of the werewolf Spunky. I don't know. We're not told anything about that. Though the eagles were always plural. Like there was always a bunch of eagles, and Thorondor was always, even back in the Book of Lost Tales, when he was called Sorondor with an S. There were always an indeterminate number of eagles, but plural number of eagles. And Thorondor was like the one named eagle among them, basically. Okay. All right. It is late and we're over time. So we almost got to the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. We came very, very close. We flirted with the Nirnaeth Arnoediad because we were talking about Maedhros and Ulfast. But anyway, we'll do a little bit more of that next time. I'm going to continue in this same pattern. And of course, we're soon going to get into the Turin story. So we will we'll see how far we get into that. My reading suggestion for this time is somewhat ambitiously. Not really, because not that many pages actually. Read to the end of the Turin story. So that is in my hardcover edition here, page 103. So when you get to the tombstone, right? When you get to the epitaph of Turin and Nienor, right there. Then right after that is a section that's labeled commentary. So let's stop. We'll talk about the commentary afterwards. But so read through to the end of the Turin story, and then we'll do as much of it as we can next time. Anyway, thanks everybody. Fun discussion as always, and I will. I see no reason. I see no reason now why I should not be able to do class next week. But then again, I've been surprised recently, so we'll see what happens. But anyway, I'm planning on next Wednesday. Thanks, everybody. Good night. See you soon.